So we continue in our series in the letter of James. And I thought I'd go back to my childhood for a moment. When I was putting this talk together, I had this flashback of this little contraption that I used to have as a kid. It was a little money dispenser, a £1 dispenser. It was spring-loaded, so if you had £1 in there or £10 in there, there's always £1 at the top, ready to dispense. And I used to get £1 a week for pocket money. And I thought, okay, 10 weeks, I'm going to have this full. I'll save up and then I'll treat myself. But I was also encouraged to tithe, to give 10% of my pocket money to church. So I'd get my £1 and then I'd have to break it up into change and I'd give 10 pence to church. And I'd end up with 90 pence of change. And I thought, and then this useless money dispenser that only took £1 coins. So I asked my parents for a raise. Could I please have £1 10p? They thought that was reasonable until I discovered that 10% of £1 10 is 11. And I ended up with 99 pence change. All this change every week. And I was thinking, I'm never going to fill this flipping thing. The strand of teaching in James's letter this week is about money. Our relationship with money, possessions, and poverty. Perhaps you feel you have money. Or perhaps you feel you have a lack of money. Are you concerned that you'll have enough to get through the month? That you'll have enough to get through retirement, perhaps? Are you saving up for holidays? Are you anxious about bills, rent, fees, Christmas presents? Are you comfortable when you think about your own money with the amount you save? Are you comfortable with the amount you spend? Are you comfortable with the amount you give away? Our relationship with money can be complex, and whatever we consider our financial status to be, James has something to say to each one of us about our relationship with money, possessions, and poverty. The first thing is the gospel changes us. The gospel changes us. And in James chapter 1, he writes this, verse 27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. To look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now, of course, religion isn't made up of looking after widows and orphans. But James argues that faith without deeds is dead. In other words, if you say that you're a Christian, but you have no concern at all for the vulnerable, you might need to think again, have I really understood? Have I really been impacted by God's grace in my life? Might I have missed the point? You see, when we discover God's radical grace, God's radical generosity, it should completely change us, including our relationship with money, possessions, and poverty. So let's take a look at two characters from the New Testament by way of example. In New Testament times, Israel was occupied by a foreign force, the Romans. And there was a man called Zacchaeus. He was an Israelite man, but he was working as a tax collector for the Romans. Now, working for the tax office in the UK today is probably something you wouldn't shout about at parties. In Israel, then, it was far worse. Zach was considered a traitor. He was working for the opposition, and people hated him. Why would an Israelite do that? Because it paid really well. There were no rules about how much extra you could take to line your own pockets. So tax collectors became very wealthy people at the expense of their neighbors. So Zacchaeus was hated. One day, Jesus came to Zach's town. And Zach was quite a short man, so he couldn't see over the crowds, but he was drawn to Jesus. He wanted to connect with him. He wanted to see him. He was also a very unpopular man, so no one was going to let him through for a front row seat. So Zacchaeus climbed a tree. Jesus noticed him and called him by name and said, "I'm coming to your house for tea." much to the disgust, I assume, of the crowd. Now, I've just come back from a holiday in Devon, so I'm assuming that Jesus and Zacchaeus are eating scones with cream and jam at this point. I'm not really sure what the Israelite equivalent was back then. But by the end of that conversation, Zacchaeus' relationship with money has completely been transformed. God's grace, it would seem, had entered his heart and changed him and his relationship with money. He said to Jesus that he's now committed to giving everything back that he's wrongly taken from his community. And Israelite law back then stipulated that such a repayment should have 20% of interest added on. Do you know how much interest Zacchaeus chose to add on? 300%. He would pay everyone back what he'd taken and 300% more. That is quite a transformation of his relationship with money. Well, let's take another example. Mary, who is Martha's sister, she brought a really expensive jar of perfume to Jesus, and she poured it out over his feet as an act of worship. She was essentially saying, all my worldly goods, all my worldly possessions, all my worldly treasures are nothing compared to you. My money is worth very little compared to you. I put it at your feet. The disciples were indignant. In fact, Judas said, this perfume could have been sold to use to help the poor. Which is quite an interesting thing for a man to say just before he betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But he's right, of course. That money could have been used to help the poor. Mary's act showed that her relationship with money and possessions was quite countercultural. But on that occasion, it didn't help those in poverty. And yet Jesus accepted her act of worship. You see, her relationship with money and possessions and poverty centered around Jesus being her number one. And that's the key. That's the challenge. That's the number one challenge that James presents to us in this strand of teaching on money. Questions for ourselves. Is Jesus at the center of our life? Are we devoted to him? And what does that look like for us? How does it affect the way we save, the way we spend, the way we give? God's grace should really change the way we relate to money and possessions and to poverty. And if it doesn't, we should probably consider, have we really got the point? Have we really reflected and understood God's grace? All that he's done for us? Has it entered our being? Is it beginning to transform us? Well, secondly, poverty takes many forms, and it's worth us bearing that in mind. James focuses, doesn't he, on widows and orphans as one example of vulnerability. And in biblical times, that typically meant material poverty. But poverty can take many forms. So we're going to dip into 2 Kings chapter 4 in just a moment. Becky's going to read it to us, where we see the prophet Elisha encounter 2 women. One who is without money and one who has money to spare. And as Becky reads this passage, consider these questions. Which of these women are vulnerable? Which of these women have great need? Which of these women requires a compassionate response? Which of these women was on God's radar? So Becky's going to read for us. You can follow along if you like. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 1 to 17. 2 Kings 4, 1 to 17.
Just waiting for a moment while you find it in the Bible. I can see the flicking. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 to 17. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a little oil." Elisha said, "Go round and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." She left him and afterwards shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There's not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." One day, Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. She said to her husband, "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." One day when Elisha came, he went up to his room and lay down there. He said to his servant Gehazi, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her, and she stood before him. Elisha said to him, "Tell her, you have gone to all this trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?" She replied, "I have a home among my own people." "What can be done for her?" Elisha asked. Gehazi said, "Well, she has no son and her husband is old." Then Elisha said, "Call her." So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. "About this time next year," Elisha said, "you'll hold a son in your arms." "No, my lord," she objected, "don't mislead your servant, O man of God." But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about the same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her.
Thanks, Becky. So I need your help at this point, so do shout out some answers and some thoughts. A woman who had no money and a woman who had money to spare. Which of these women do you think were vulnerable? Who would you say? Both? Are we in agreement? Different ideas? Not a trick question. Might sound like one. The poor one, the first one. Let's have a look at them one by one then. So the widow, the woman without money, she was particularly vulnerable, wasn't she? She was particularly vulnerable and in desperate, immediate need. In biblical times, husbands were the main breadwinner and also the protector. Hence, James's concern for widows and orphans. There was no government aid to rely on, and this woman has nothing in her cupboards except a dash of oil. And even her sons were about to be sold into slavery to pay for the family debts. She could lose everything and die of starvation. The prophet, the man of God Elisha, intervenes with a miracle that ends her material poverty and further family loss. Clearly vulnerable. The rich woman, though, she's surely okay. She used some of her wealth to provide this prophet, this man of God, with his own room so that he could use it when he passes through her town. And when he asks what he can do for her, she says in verse 13, "I have a home among my own people." In other words, I'm secure. I've got everything I need. But was that entirely true? What was her great need? If need's the right word. What was her great need, her great want, her great pain, if you like, and her desire? Did you spot it? Go on, Sarah. A child, to have a child. She was childless, and her husband, we're told, was old. She was soon to be on her own. She perhaps would be a widow too. And we know that she desperately yearns for a child because when Elisha says that she will become pregnant, what's her response? She says in verse 16, "No, my Lord, please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." In other words, don't build up my hopes. The disappointment would be too much to bear. But the woman did become pregnant. And the next year, about the same time, she gave birth to a son. just as Elisha had told her. So which of these women required a compassionate response? Both. Both of these women required compassion and understanding of their situations. Which of these women were on God's radar? Both. Jim, you're on fire. And a question for you to answer in your own minds. Which of these women do you most resonate with? Do you have a deep need that you desperately want God to intervene in? You are on his radar. You are on his radar. The widow faced material poverty. Perhaps we can call the rich woman's desperation for a child a type of relational poverty. Scripture expresses multiple times that God does have a special concern for those who are extremely vulnerable, like the widow. But it also opens up many different forms of poverty to us: material, relational, emotional poverty, spiritual poverty, and more. And all forms of poverty are on God's radar. As a church, I think we've got a growing appetite for God to help us to respond to different types of poverty in the community around us with compassion and understanding. Poverty is complex, and we as a church will need wisdom from God and resource from him to help us to engage in a way that really begins to address those needs in a responsible and helpful way. And James encourages us. In chapter 2, verse 5, he says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." The gospel changes us. The gospel changes our relationship with money, possessions, and poverty. And poverty takes many forms. So let's move on to our financial choices. Our financial choices matter. Becky's going to read to us one more time. This time, James chapter 5, verse 1 to 6. And as you hear this reading, consider the question, who is James talking to? Becky.
James chapter 5, verses 1 to 6. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent people who were not opposing you.
So who is James talking to? Any ideas? All of us, perhaps? Give me a bit more. What have you read? He says the rich, greedy, hoarders, perhaps, powerful. Yeah, all those things. It's likely that James was addressing Christians because he was writing to the church, so why would he be writing to people who weren't there? He was addressing Christians who hire people to work for them, people who are also desperately reliant on each day's wage to come in to get by. However, James is also talking, by implication, to Christians who have enough money to impact others, and especially to impact the vulnerable. If we've got enough money to buy tea, coffee, a pair of jeans, a pair of trainers, for example, then we fall into this category. Our choice of tea, coffee, jeans, trainers, as examples, can contribute to the exploitation of vulnerable people who face various forms of poverty. And James writes this, as we just heard: "You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty." When James talks about the last days, you have hoarded wealth in the last days, he's talking about the period between Jesus' resurrection and Jesus' second coming. So we're living in that period now, that period of the last days. He's talking of the revelation that every Christian will have had, not like Old Testament Israelites who didn't quite know how God was going to bring salvation, but those who have seen that Jesus came, he died on a cross, he paid for our sin, he brought us freedom that comes through his resurrection. We've seen that, we've read about that, we know that, we experience that because we live in the last days. And yet, James says, you live as if it didn't happen. James is condemning Christians who live as if those events didn't happen. Christians who might say it with their lips, but the way they spend their money, the way they save their money, the way they give or don't give suggests that those things never happened. James is saying, you know the freedom that comes in Christ because he died on the cross for you, and yet you continue to put your security in money, or you continue to look for money to buy you the clothes that give you the affirmation that you desire from other people, or any of those things that essentially mean you're making an idol out of money because you're seeking money or things like it to meet your deepest needs. You haven't really allowed Jesus to meet your deepest needs of security or affirmation or status. At the cross, Jesus inferred onto us a status that is so countercultural. We become children of God, we become free. And yet if our financial choices, if our debit card, our statements suggest that we're no different to anyone else in this world, then we're not living counterculturally. We're not living as if Jesus' death and resurrection has really taken place. We're not living as if the grace of God has really entered our lives and made a difference. That is why James says, you've hoarded wealth in the last days. The last days, this period, is a significant period where we should be living differently. James knows that when we look for our deepest needs to be met in other things like money, we're willing to tread all over other people to get those needs met, to get what we want. And some of our financial choices will make a mockery, therefore, of Jesus' death and resurrection. James goes further. He says in verse 6, "You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." Your version might say, the innocent ones. I think it's more accurately translated, the innocent one. It's both really, isn't it? We're treading all over innocent ones, and by doing that, we're murdering all over again Jesus Christ, the innocent one. He's the only one that's truly innocent, who was never opposing us in the first place, but was always for us. And therefore we bring judgment on ourselves. It's hard, isn't it? It's a hard teaching. And it gives us reason to reflect and think. Has the gospel of grace really affected the way I relate to money and possessions and poverty? And it'll look different for each of us. You know, it's right to be prudent. It's right to make a will, to invest in a pension. But when we hoard, when we're driven by an insecurity, a lack of trust that Jesus has got us now and in the future, that's when we're crossing a line that only deeper reflection on the gospel of grace can solve. It's fine to spend money on ourselves, to make ourselves presentable, to do ourselves up. But when that becomes lavish spending, driven by a desire to be loved and affirmed by others, we're crossing a line that only deeper reflection on the gospel of grace can solve. A question to consider in your own minds. Is your need for security, for status, for power, for control, for affirmation completely met in Jesus? What do your financial choices say about God's grace in your life? Now I've got a bit of a confession to make. I preached on James 5, 1-6 a few years ago, and I really got clued up, I think, about ethical spending. I made a commitment to make more ethical choices about my spending, to look into brands and whether they were responsible employers or responsible to the environment, responsible to those around them and so on. But it can be really hard to get it right. It's really complex. Some brands I'd written off and then suddenly think, oh, maybe they're not so bad, and maybe I'll go back to them. And maybe the alternative brands, actually I can't get what I need from them. The jeans that just don't fit these lanky legs. What do I do? It's really hard. And if I'm honest, I find it so hard I stop bothering. I start bothering to look into who are the more ethical brands and who are the worst perpetrators. If I'm honest, I prefer to distance myself from the problems that are further down the production line. I wonder if many of us are in a similar position. There was a telling documentary where a presenter visited the CEO and founder of Nike, the trainer manufacturer. The CEO was called Philip Knight, and the presenter went bearing two first-class tickets for a flight to Indonesia, and invited Philip to go with him to Indonesia to visit his factories where trainers were made and to walk through those factories. Philip bursts out laughing. No, not a chance. The presenter asks, have you ever been to see your factories where your shoes are made? Nope, he responds, and I'm not going to go. It's this kind of distance that allows social injustice to grow. And I'm guilty of it too. I'd rather distance myself from the problems that are further down the production line. A few years ago, a boy from Indonesia was put on stage at a conference to be a face and a voice to some of these injustices of such factories. He pointed to a giant scar down his face. I got this scar, he said, when my master lashed out at me for not working hard enough. When it began to bleed, he did not want me to stop working or to ruin the cloth in front of me, so he took a lighter and he burned it shut. I got this making stuff for you, he said. Poverty is personal. Our financial choices, James says, reflects our faith. So when we're looking at a bargain, consider, why is it a bargain? Who might be losing out so that I can make this small win? Perhaps download an app that helps us to score brands. Some people have done the hard work for us. All the scoring systems are different. You might have to look into that and consider in what ways brands are scored differently. Maybe that's something that would interest you and help you to navigate how you make financial choices. I haven't really got any easy answers for you. There's a magazine called Ethical Consumer that's good on this, but it might be quite a tough one to jump in if you're just starting out in this. A friend of mine said, just commit to making one difference every season, whether that's every term or every year. Just commit to making one financial change, whether that's to do with your food or your clothes or something else, what you're investing in, or where you get your utilities from. Give yourself, he said, plenty of grace, because it's really hard and you could beat yourself up about it. But what James is looking at is, do we have a heart that's impacted by grace that would give us that desire and that motivation to even try? On one hand, the church has been characterized by a lion, to be courageous and strong, and sometimes as a lamb, because the church also seeks peace, but never as a chameleon, just to blend in and make no difference at all. It's hard to persevere and to push through with some of this stuff, I know that. And again, James says, to remind you of that verse, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. So to finish, I've had a go at paraphrasing James chapter 1, verse 27. And if I was to write it, I might put it like this. Don't be polluted by the world. Have a courageous and radical faith that holds money and possessions loosely and serves the most vulnerable with genuine interest, compassion, and understanding. That is a faith that has been genuinely impacted by God's grace.